Levels sort of came out of my own realization from a very stressful period, very exciting period of my life where I was burning the candle at both ends and was really pushing myself into metabolic dysfunction. And I just happened to stumble on it and realize that this is the tool, the beginning of the tool set that will give people control over their health in the future. I look back on 2020 as an extremely interesting event for Levels because it put us on the map right at the time that we were in the midst of trying to develop our very first version of the product. And largely because there was this moment in time with COVID that forced people to pay attention to the underlying epidemic of metabolic disease that is sort of silently there, but always making us less resilient than we should be. Regardless of how advanced you are in your career, how specialized you are, you're expected to communicate in a way that anyone at the table, regardless of their background, can understand and contribute to. And that's key because it avoids the sense that you are too ill-informed or uneducated to contribute to a conversation, or you don't have the experience, and it enables everyone literally to stay on the same context.
Josh, it's a pleasure to see you. I've been following Levels since the early days, and I'm really excited to do this and have this discussion together. How about we start about the prehistory? I believe you have an awesome prehistory with the likes of SpaceX. So why don't we start from that?
Well, Kyriakos, I'm excited to come on the show and definitely have enjoyed being in touch and connecting about the space for a long time. Yeah, I mean, to go back to the beginning, I never had much of an interest in health beyond physical fitness growing up. So I was always into sports. After school, where I played a bunch of club sports in university, I started to do CrossFit, became a CrossFit trainer. Generally, if I could run fast, lift heavy weights, jump high, I figured that's the picture of health. And it wasn't until I was deep into my professional career, I was working at SpaceX on the astronaut life support program, which was a brand new first for SpaceX. We had been basically an empty box. The spacecraft just carries supplies up to the International Space Station, but it didn't have to sustain life. And so when we started to do that at SpaceX, we had to make NASA very comfortable that we could keep humans alive. And that was my first project at SpaceX where health came into the picture. And I started to be involved with the mission doctors and the long-term crew sustainability concepts. And I had these moments of realization. I was working on an extremely stressful project, the most stressful moments of my life, but also the most exhilarating and exciting. And I was physically fit. I was working out as frequently as I could, typically every day or every other day. And in the context of the life support program, I had a few weird moments where I realized personally that although I looked healthy, I did not feel healthy. So I was literally sleeping under my desk in the middle of the day, like having to sneak a nap, just wanting to sit down, feeling low energy, feeling shaky. Simultaneously, on the program itself, we were developing these really fantastic systems for the spacecraft. But there would be these moments where we would have all this data telling us that the vehicle was operating properly. But I would realize, and I'd have this weird sort of sense that we wouldn't have any data on the astronaut within the vehicle. So we wouldn't know if they were healthy or in what that even means. And so I started to combine these two concepts and started researching for myself, what would sensing health look like? What would you have to measure in order to know the health state of somebody? And I started to experiment myself, and eventually this led to continuous glucose monitoring. It led to a realization that I have impaired fasting glucose and impaired glucose tolerance myself, despite never having been told that by any doctor. And ultimately that kicked off a realization that CGM is just the first of many future technologies that will give people continuous real-time insight into their health state, and they'll be able to live in the driver's seat instead of having to offshore that to another physician or something. So that's the long story short, is Levels sort of came out of my own realization from a very stressful period, very exciting period of my life where I was burning the candle at both ends and was really pushing myself into metabolic dysfunction. And I just happened to stumble on it and realize that this is the tool, the beginning of the tool set that will give people control over their health in the future.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to also ask some questions about early days in SpaceX in terms of the culture, and what are the things that you learned from the approach what did you learn from Elon? What did you learn from the approach of SpaceX? What did you learn from the way of thinking?
So many things. The things I took away from SpaceX, first of all, it's not for everyone, but it is, for me, having worked in many different environments since, it is the pinnacle of fast-moving technological breakthrough. There's not many places in the world where you can be an engineer to work on hardware problems and get the sort of condensed experience that you get at SpaceX. Things happen literally 10 times faster there. And the reason for that is, I think, two things. There are no arbitrary barriers. So even something, I think a good exploration of this is something as simple as language. There is a no acronyms policy at SpaceX. If you look at any other aerospace program in US history, it is rife with acronyms. You can read an entire page and you will have no idea what that page is describing, because everything from the project to the intention to the outcome is condensed into acronyms, which you have to have a glossary to understand. At SpaceX, that's not tolerated. Everyone is expected to communicate regardless of how advanced you are in your career, how specialized you are. You're expected to communicate in a way that anyone at the table, regardless of their background, can understand and contribute to. And that's key, because it avoids the sense that you are too ill-informed or uneducated to contribute to a conversation, or you don't have the experience. And it enables everyone literally to stay in on the same context. And that genuinely means that people who are just interns are walking in the door, and within a few weeks, they're contributing in a significant way to major initiatives that have been going on for a long time. And so something as simple as language, and it'll be funny because you would sit at a conference room table at SpaceX, and it will sound like people are explaining things to children. They'll literally be using very, very basic, simple analogies for what they're trying to achieve. Something as simple as, we need to just put legs on the rocket, and then the legs should unfold, and then the rocket can land on the pad. That doesn't sound like advanced aerospace conversation, but that's how it happens at SpaceX, and it's a key part, is avoiding limitations on other people being able to contribute. And then the second thing is extreme accountability. There is a responsible engineer framework, is what it's called at SpaceX, where one single individual is accountable regardless of what happens for the outcome of a project. And what that means is that there's just, whether or not the product or the project failed because you did something personally, or because some vendor across the ocean wasn't able to deliver on time, at the end of the day, the buck stops with the person. There's no design by committee. There's no sort of putting responsibility in a distributed format. It's one person owns a project beginning to end, and that's that. And it's very unique, especially when you have such a relatively young workforce. A lot of the people I was working with were, when I started at SpaceX, it was literally my first job out of school, and having that much responsibility can feel really overwhelming. But for a certain type of person, it's exactly what you want, especially at a certain time in life. And I genuinely believe, because of that single-threaded leader, single-threaded accountability framework that SpaceX has, they are able to just make progress where others might run into sort of committee hurdles.
And how big are those projects that the people lead? Is it very small ones or very big ones?
That structure scales completely through the organization. So all the way to small projects, so small subsystems, up to the largest. So the first stage of the rocket. So basically the system that lifts off, the engines fire, takes the vehicle into the first stages of space flight. That project, the first stage, is owned by a responsible engineer, and then a subsystem on it, just a little mechanism that opens or closes, would also have a responsible engineer. So, there are, and there's really, what's interesting is there aren't that many other distinguishing titles at SpaceX. They don't anchor significantly on titles. It's really about everyone wants to be in charge of as much scope as possible. That's the underlying objective. And one of the major, not every engineer at SpaceX is a responsible engineer, meaning there are engineers who are contributing engineers who work on projects that are owned by REs. And so that's the first thing, is when you walk in the door and you see how much scope and ownership and accountability a responsible engineer gets at SpaceX, that's the first thing you want. Most engineers are just like, I want to be a responsible engineer. Yep. And someday I want to work my way up to owning a large portion of the vehicle. I want to be the responsible engineer of the entire spacecraft someday. And there are only a few of those at SpaceX. But what I love about it is that it's very simple. Title does not determine ownership at SpaceX. Ownership does. And just keeping so arbitrary sort of promotion schemas like titles. I think we've all seen this in business these days, is like, just like we have a lot of compensation inflation in certain times, you also have title inflation, where all of a sudden there are 50 vice presidents of so-and-so and directors and managers. keeping a simple framework like the responsible engineer framework is something I came away with a very strong impression that helps.
Incredible. I think we could speak about this for hours. But when you started thinking and having the problem that you mentioned earlier regarding levels, um, what was it that you came up with the idea and then you started trying to find co-founders, or was it you found co-founders and then you came up with the idea? And then the follow-up question to that would be, how did you meet each other?
So for me, because I kind of think of myself as patient zero for Levels. I actually tried a continuous glucose monitor on its own as a total experiment with no ambitions of starting a company at the time. I mean, I've always had an entrepreneurial bent to myself, but at the time I was not searching for a startup idea. But it was the impact that information had on me in such a rapid time. So I went from having really no concern for sleep quality, for stress management. These were things that I thought I can worry about that when I'm old. Right now, I'm young, I'm healthy, I'm fit. I don't need to, I can sleep 4.5, 5 hours and get back to work. I can work out at 10 p.m. and still sleep well. I can drink coffee until the end of the day. These were the things I was doing at the time because, again, what I thought was physical fitness, gym fitness equals health. And so when that CGM went on my body and I started to see the degree of chaos that I was inflicting on myself after a 4-hour sleep cycle, when my blood sugar hasn't come below 107 or 108 milligrams per deciliter all night long, and is spiking chaotically from my morning breakfast and from my coffee, and all of these things started to immediately change my behaviors. And so after about 2 weeks, I had read more and considered more my lifestyle habits than ever before in my life. And so that, and it ultimately led to an entire lifestyle transformation for me. I reconsidered everything that I do. I now have a deep appreciation for all that. But anyway, because of all that, it was just it was impossible not to feel like, why is this tool not on the arms of every person out there? I mean, what is the real reason that this isn't common? Because I had to jump through hoops. I literally had to get somebody to bring a continuous glucose monitor to me from Australia because my own doctor would not write me a prescription for one. So that was the sort of backstory I skipped over. But I had such a struggle getting one of these devices, and then it literally changed my life in a few weeks. I thought, there's a real opportunity to help people get healthier and feel healthier the way I am. And so that started. So I decided to leave SpaceX. I actually worked at Hyperloop on it's a sort of another Elon Musk idea for a year, and that was when I was really incubating this idea. I was measuring blood sugar continuously. I was deep in the rabbit hole, reading a lot of papers and considering how might this become something I could work on full time. And then I left and worked on it full time for about 1.5 years by myself. And the reason for that is that I did not think that there was a strategy that was obvious for how to leverage the technology other than building a new device. So the most obvious thing to me as a mechanical engineer was build a new monitoring system specifically for people who do not have diabetes. And that's a really hard problem. So I spent 1.5 years just kind of turning over various business ideas and trying to refine a strategy. And ultimately, my co-founder, who I had already known for many years, Sam Korkos, he ended up having an exit event for his company, which at the time was Cardash. He was working in this sort of scaled auto maintenance space. And he wanted to get into something more meaningful, something like healthcare. And it just so happened that I was 1.5 years in and kind of hitting all these walls, all these obstacles that were largely due to the fact that I was just one person and I was just turning in circles. Long story short, Sam and I trusted each other a lot. We had known each other for years. We had very similar worldview and principles, and we sort of just clicked. And in the course of a weekend, he went from hearing about the story, seeing the CGM device and how it operated, to being all in and wanting to very specifically focus on making the software layer that can help people interpret that CGM data, because that was the clearest path for him to testing this idea in the market.
Mm-hmm. Incredible. There are so many questions I have about Levels because you have one of the most fascinating cultures. You have one of the most fascinating products. You have one of the most fascinating branding strategy that a lot of people know you around the world. I'll try to get as many questions as possible. But having said that, you met with Sam, you came up, you spent a year understanding what was going on. And then did you? What was the launch strategy of the product? What were the first steps?
So, as I said, I was considering a lot of different business plans. And one of them was to simply take the existing devices. These are devices developed by Abbott and Dexcom for diabetes management, and adding a software layer on them. And you can think of this exactly the same way that you can think of Aura and Whoop and many other devices that measure heart rate and heart rate variability in sleep. Yep. They all use what's called a PPG sensor, a photoplethysmography sensor. It's a green LED and a detector, and sometimes there's a red LED that measures oxygen. Long story short, that sensor package is shared. But what's different between all these companies is how the software helps you understand, interpret, and take action on the data. That was missing for continuous glucose sensing. So there was an instant opportunity because the devices existed, but they were very, very basic. They just simply gave you a number. You couldn't even scan the numbers or zoom in on the chart. You could really do nothing to better interpret the data. There was an opportunity to prototype the experience by putting CGMs in the hands of people who were interested and then just engaging with them about that experience and what they would like to know more that wasn't available to them through the manufacturer product, if that makes sense. So literally what we did is, and a lot of this is due to Sam's experience as a prior founder, knowing that distribution is everything. Don't make assumptions, don't build something that shouldn't exist. And this is an Elonism as well, but really just test your assumptions. So we started off by simply shipping a product, which was a prescription interaction with a physician, a licensed physician in your state, and a pharmacy that could fulfill the CGMs. So we needed to make sure that we were above the regulatory floor, meaning these devices are controlled here in the US. We had to make sure that everyone had a prescription and that a physician encounter had occurred and that they were pharmacy fulfilled. So once we got that in place, we actually started to sell that as a product in and of itself with no additional app. So Levels hadn't built software on top of it. Once people had the devices in hand, we would then just text them and we would ask them questions, lots and lots of questions. What are you experiencing? What are you seeing? What's confusing about that? And that would surface so many of these opportunities for a software to fill in the gaps. And a lot of this was around, why is this happening? It's counterintuitive, or this is super intuitive, but I need to better understand it. It's like, I feel this way. I've always felt that my heart rate increases when I eat oatmeal, but why is that happening? And so we, insights and interpretation and food logging became the core features that we then started rapidly building in our software. So I think to kind of make it short again, we shipped a product that wasn't a product. It was just access to a device. We prototyped the experience that way, and it was just a lot of customer interaction.
That's incredible. It's the doing what users want, YC philosophy. I think that YC brought a lot up, but it makes so much sense. And then when you did that and you saw customer interest and you saw what features they wanted you to build and so on, what did you do next?
So that was, we were a very small team at the time. Sam is a software engineer by background. And so he and our other co-founder, David, so we brought on a number of other co-founders after the initial founding of the company who had expertise in the core areas of the future product stack. So that was product, engineering, and medical. And so, and those were David Flinner, Andrew Connor, and Casey Means, respectively. And so between Sam and David and Andrew, we started to very quickly build a prototype experience, which we were just shipping iterations literally on an hourly basis. And the very first version was something super basic. It was basically a charting app that you could now pull in the CGM data, zoom in, pan. Then we started adding food logging because that's the core experience for most people. I mean, the Levels mission is to solve the metabolic health crisis. But the way that we're going about this is very deliberate. And the first step is showing people how food affects their health. So that's the core experience loop for a CGM is you sit down, you eat something for lunch. What's the reaction to that action in your body? Because there is a reaction. Your body experiences some impact from that food. So now you can see the reaction within 30 minutes, right? And so it's core to be able to log that food and then understand how your body responded to it over the course of a few hours. So we started shipping the logging features. And then it was a lot of compare functionality. So people wanted to know, how does the same meal affect me today versus yesterday? Because today I got 8 hours of sleep and yesterday I got 4 hours of sleep. So compare functionality. Then it was importing additional metrics because we wanted to show people how powerful something as simple as taking a walk can be. So we did a community challenge where we gave everybody a full sugar Coca-Cola and asked them to drink that Coke and then sit still, don't do anything. And then the next day or 2 days later, drink another one of those Cokes and go for a walk 20 to 40 minutes long. And we can show people by showing them their step count and their heart rate overlaid on the data that 28% of the area under the curve, so basically the elevation of the glucose, is just wiped out when you just go for a casual walk. And we were able to show people that. So those are the features we started shipping, and some of the mechanisms that we did, like that community challenge, to get people involved and get them trying and experimenting. And so there's much more. We did program designs where we would tell people, week 1, don't do anything, just put the device on and observe how your body is responding to your normal daily actions. Don't change anything. Then weeks 2 and 3, let's start to experiment, right? Let's explore the boundary box. Let's, try that pizza, try alcohol, try whatever it is in your life that you do, but maybe you don't do on a daily basis. Let's explore. And then on week 4, that's when you want to pull it all together and try to optimize, like go for ideal scores. So we had developed a meal score. We had developed a day score, which takes all the sort of blood sugar dynamics throughout the day and turns it into a single understandable score. And so try to dial that in. So that's how the program evolved, is at first through features, then through feedback mechanisms like scores, and then finally through sort of a program design.
How did the first people hear about Levels?
So the very first people that became our customers were largely family and investors. So people who they were very interested in the concept initially. Certainly our investors were, and that's kind of why they wanted to take a swing. And then they wanted to experience what we were describing or what I had demonstrated from my CGM. So those were a lot of the first. And then it was very interesting because we started the company in June of 2019, and we were in stealth mode essentially until the beginning of 2020. I had been working on, as I mentioned, this concept for about a year and a half prior to that. So since 2017. So there was a lot of people that I had spoken with, and that we generally had a lot of people who were familiar. And once we came out of stealth, people started talking about it on Twitter. They found it so fascinating to see how a daily habit that they had been leaning on, that they thought was healthy for the longest time, was actually potentially working against their goals. And people started to just sort of organically put this on their social channels. Twitter was a major part. And all of a sudden we saw this nonlinear just take off from basically January of 2020. And then COVID hit. And during COVID, people were stuck in home. They were thinking a lot about health and how to develop resilience. And I think they were spending a lot of time looking into what tools were out there to give them a little bit more control, a little more awareness. I think we all felt a deep sense of insecurity about our health. And once the revelations about COVID and metabolic health or metabolic disorder became clear, there was a dramatic increase in likelihood of mortality and complications from COVID with metabolic disorder. That further sort of increased the attention on Levels. And so through 2020, we had a massive, basically entirely organic. We were doing zero marketing, and we had a wait list that grew to, it was close to 100,000 people by the end of 2020. And we just weren't able to, we simply were not able to scale our systems to be able to get to that order of magnitude. And so it was a very, I look back on 2020 as an extremely interesting event for Levels, because it put us on the map right at the time that we were in the midst of trying to develop our very first version of the product. And largely because there was this moment in time with COVID that forced people to pay attention to the underlying epidemic of metabolic disease that is sort of silently there, but always making us less resilient than we should be.
I think, by the way, I just remember that when I was meeting with folks in San Francisco, there was no single investor I met that was not wearing the Levels at the time you're mentioning. So that was very funny, because basically we're going to very similar folks because of the similarity of the technology that we are building as well. And it was so funny that everybody was showing me their Levels back in the day.
That's great.
Yeah, I think one of the things I wanted to ask too is, you created the term metabolic health. You created the terms that are related with metabolic health. And how did you come up with the words? How did you come up with these ideas?
So I don't want us to take full credit for coining the terms, because people like Rob Lustig and Dom D'Agostino and Ben Bickman and Sarah Gottfried, all of our amazing advisors now, but initially the people who are inspiring this effort have been working in the metabolic sciences for a very long time. And I think what we can take some credit for is really establishing two concepts. One is that metabolic health is something that affects everyone, and it's something that we can improve. So that's the first important thing, is most people believe that they either have a fast metabolism or a slow metabolism. That's the sort of a traditional concept. And in reality, just like physical health, it's something that you actually have to build and work on over time. And if you ignore it, it deteriorates just into the future. So I think putting that concept out there, and then amplifying the message around this and making it something that people pay attention to in the way that they pay, that we had so much focus on mental health not so long ago. And I think those are the things that Levels has done. If I can take some credit, our team has done exceptionally well, is really amplifying that message. But it's a message that I think has been around for a long time, but has not had due attention on it. And I think it's mostly because people just associate it with these things like diabetes, like I'm not diabetic, therefore I shouldn't worry about this. And the reality is, again, we're all on a spectrum of metabolic health, and we need to focus on our metabolic fitness. The day-to-day actions that we're taking, those compound over decades into an outcome. And, this is not something that happens overnight where all of a sudden you have a slow metabolism or you have a metabolic disorder. This is something that we build towards. Mm-hmm. So, I think it's really just, as we were talking to people and realizing that this is what we were doing, right? Our product was improving. The objective was to improve metabolic health. And what's on the other side of that? Well, it's the metabolic health crisis. Right now, you have 91% of people in the United States have at least one marker of metabolic syndrome, meaning they are not metabolically healthy. 91%. 33-ish and increasing percent of people are pre-diabetic or diabetic already, and that number is increasing at an increasing rate. There's like 100 million people with pre-diabetes. So this is something that's out there. It's affecting everybody, and just people weren't talking about it. So we just saw that as an opportunity. Like, this is the tool that can give that to the people.
And then we were going circles around glucose and insulin, but why don't we speak a bit about that? What happens with specific carbohydrates that we eat? How that happens how does glucose change? What's the correlation with insulin?
So, I think we should also maybe define, because still not everyone is thinking about metabolism or metabolic health, but metabolism is essentially the set of systems and mechanisms that takes our food and our environment and turns it into energy. So our cells, they have to break down our food, the nutrients we take in, sunlight, water, et cetera, and turns this into energy inside the cell. And that is called metabolism. That's the metabolic processes. So effectively, what the modern human kind of relies on for the vast majority of our energy is this molecule called glucose, which is another term for sugar. Table sugar that you have at home is 50% glucose roughly, and then the other 50% is fructose. So glucose is the primary molecule for energy in the modern human. And it's really important. Like, if it drops to below a certain level, we can die or certainly lose consciousness and that sort of thing. But actually, the majority of us in modern times are not facing that issue. We're facing the other issue, which is when glucose is constantly elevated and spiking, and basically creating lots of variability. So spikes and crashes in our glucose level. So basically, our bodies are constantly trying to maintain a very tight window for glucose levels. So we have the sugar circulating in our blood, and it needs to make its way into the cells and to be turned into energy. And the way that process occurs is from a hormone called insulin. So you have glucose circulating. In order for it to get into a cell, this hormone, insulin, is released by the pancreas, and it acts as a key. So it locks onto the cells, the surface of the cells, and it unlocks the cell wall. And basically, glucose can then pass through the cell into the center of the cell, where it starts to be processed and turned into ATP for energy. So it's a complex, but it's an important dance. Essentially, the amount of glucose determines the amount of insulin necessary to get that amount of glucose into the body or into the cells. Because again, the body wants to keep glucose in that low and controlled, just constant band. So what happens that we see today, and this is evidenced by the fact that about 95% of people with diabetes in the United States have type 2 diabetes, which is distinct from type 1. Type 1 is a condition where your body no longer produces insulin, right? So that hormone that opens the cell wall doesn't get produced. Therefore, your glucose levels start to go super high, and you're also not able to produce energy from that glucose. It's a really bad situation. That's about 5% of diabetes. The other 95% is actually where our bodies stop responding to the insulin that we are producing. So the cells no longer open up when the insulin key locks onto them. And that essentially creates similar situation for the body as type 1 diabetes, in that glucose levels start to rise and rise and rise. And simultaneously, insulin levels are rising and rising as your body tries to keep up. And this is called insulin resistance, and it creates a cascade of really bad downstream effects. It affects every system in the body, everything from the eyes, sexual dysfunction, physical fitness, cardiovascular health, all the way to skin health. So basically all that extra glucose starts to bind onto things and stick to things, and it creates what's called glycation, which is damage to the skin, wrinkles, browning of the skin, all that sort of stuff. So essentially, as that insulin resistance mechanism starts to play out, glucose goes crazy, and it starts to damage a lot of systems. And so that's our objective, is to show people what actions they're taking that are creating instability in their glucose levels and that could be driving insulin resistance, and let's start to improve those behaviors.
Mm-hmm. And what's the correlation with nutrition? Are there certain foods? Can we speak about certain foods that are elevating that and so on?
Yeah. So I mean, again, glucose it's a critical nutrient. We need it in our lives. Our brains run on the majority. Our brains primarily run on sugar, on glucose. But that said, we want to help our bodies maintain a consistent band of glucose. We don't want to be driving huge elevations and creating a cascade of variability. That's really damaging. So the best way, a lot of the advice that's put out by advisors like Rob Lustig, whose work I highly recommend. You should read Metabolical, Ben Bickman's book, Why We Get Sick, Dr. Sarah Gottfried's book, The Hormone Reset. All of these talk about these same elements. And essentially what we need to do is avoid processed foods that contain highly refined carbohydrates. I can't stress that enough. It's that when we eat whole foods that come, out of the ground and eat them in their whole form, they contain carbohydrates. Lots of these plants and vegetables contain a good proportion of carbohydrates, but they're contained in a matrix that has a lot of fiber, a lot of water, and is essentially digested in a completely different way. It's a slow breakdown with a lot of fiber that controls how quickly the carbohydrates in that food can make it into the bloodstream. And this makes it really easy for our bodies to keep up. The situation is when you then strip out all of that fiber and all of that water and turn it into a refined flour or a grain or a granulated sugar, and then put that into a reconstituted, highly processed food, chips, desserts, cereals, these sorts of things that when you have a CGM on, you see that when you consume that, it's essentially instantaneously causing a blood sugar spike. That's because there's, you don't have those natural food mechanisms, whole food mechanisms slowing digestion. So those are I would say that's one of the biggest elements, is that we need to be consuming whole foods in their original state. And then the importance of protein and fat, basically a balanced micronutrient and macronutrient profile. If you have there's actually a great study that showed if you sit down with 3 equal portions of carbohydrates, protein, and fat on a plate, and you consume them from carbohydrate first, then protein, then fat, then you switch the order, eat the same meal the next day, and consume it with proteins and fats first, and then carbohydrates last, the effect on blood sugar and insulin release is about 50% better when you eat the protein and fat first. So this has been demonstrated time and time again. So when we eat our salad and our meat or our protein serving before we have the bread, right? We actually are improving our body's ability to maintain glucose control and insulin control. That's a key point, is that we were also showing that insulin is improved. So it is benefiting us on the insulin resistance spectrum. So these are some of the things where you want to have a balanced macronutrient profile, and you want to eat whole foods.
Excellent. And there's this in the bodybuilding space. There is a lot about the post-workout glycemic window. Is this a myth? Is it something that is necessary? What's your view?
It's a great question, and I would say this is where I'm going to lean heavily on personal variability. We are not all the same. This is one of the most amazing things I've learned through Levels, is just how different we each are in terms of how our bodies respond to the exact same stimulus, the exact same inputs. So I'm somebody who has very volatile blood sugar. I have high fasting glucose. I have a very aggressive response to simple foods, even black coffee. If I just drink black coffee, I have a blood sugar spike. In some cases, a dramatic one, depending on how poorly I've slept.
This is surprising.
So it's very, even among people now who have been using Levels for a long time, I'm one of the few people that has that response. So I would firstly say that there isn't a one size fits all answer to this. Secondly, one of the first things I saw when I tried a CGM for the first time was exactly this effect. I was somebody who, like I said, I lived in gyms. I was obsessed with musculature and making sure that I was bulking up at the right times and staying lean simultaneously. And so it was a lot of carb loading and glycogen replenishing, right? So loading carbs so you have energy for that workout, and then replenishing the glycogen that you depleted from the workout immediately after. So I was eating lots and lots of carbohydrates, brown rice, sweet potatoes, whole grain pasta. And what I found is that my blood sugar from those carb loads and glycogen replenishments, regardless of how aggressive my workout is or how long, completely, just sort of blew through the roof in terms of blood sugar control. I would have a huge spike. Let's say I was carb loading for a workout. I would have a shake with a lot of carb, banana, maybe some bran flakes, et cetera, on my way to the gym. Well, I'd have this huge blood sugar spike. I would then be walking up to the bar for the first set, and my blood sugar is now crashing down through the floor, and my energy is lost. I mean, I used to yawn in the gym at 10 a.m. because I now realized my blood sugar was crashing through the floor, and all that energy was being soaked up. Then for the glycogen replenishment, it just turns out that I was massively overdoing it for my body. I just did not need that many carbs. And in fact, I was probably causing myself a lot of trouble with inflammation and just the variation and the crashes, just lowering my energy because I was overdoing it so much. That said, I know a lot of people who have similar build to me who were eating similar nutrition profiles and were having completely controlled blood sugar. So my point is that I think you have to dial this stuff in, and you need some feedback to know whether or not you're overdoing it. In general, my emphasis is on protein. I eat high protein, moderate fat, low carb diet, and that's where I feel best. And that's certainly how I perform best in the gym. I don't have those issues anymore. I would say one last thing on this is that a lot of the gym nutrition culture comes from looking at the elite, looking at the best of the best for athletics, and saying that this is what the best performance looks like, so everyone should copy that. The reality is, at the time that I'm describing for me, I was spending most of my time at work, working really hard, certainly, but it's knowledge work. I was not physically exerting myself. And I would go to the gym and I would work out hard for 60 to 90 minutes. But I'm not somebody who's training for 3, 4, 5 hours a day. And so I should not be copying what elite athletes, elite CrossFit athletes, or Tour de France athletes are doing for my carbohydrate intake. And we make that mistake all the time. Everybody looks at what the elites are doing, and there's a difference between elite performance and optimal health, right? So what they're doing is pursuing golds in the event that they're competing in. What we're doing is trying to perform well as team employees, husbands and wives, and so on and so forth. And so there's a very big difference. I just want to draw that conclusion, is just that even if it is important to glycogen replenish and carb load, let's make sure we're doing it for the lifestyles we actually lead, not the lifestyles that elite athletes lead.
Mm-hmm. Speaking about that, how much does glucose change based on the activity? And activity being, what if someone that is trying to add muscle versus someone that is in an endurance, preparing for an endurance event?
So there's a really dramatic difference for most people between the high intensity and low intensity modalities. So I'm sure everybody's hearing these days about zone 2 exercise, low and controlled heart rate training or lactate threshold training. So when I'm training in a zone 2, my blood sugar sort of just monotonically decreases. It sort of just declines over time. And then I actually do crash. I experience a bonk after something like 90 minutes. So a CGM can be a really powerful tool to show you how that happens and to sort of pick your refueling time. So to take on more carbohydrates before you hit that steep dip and lose all your energy. The interesting thing is, on the high intensity side, the triggers and the sort of signals that your body is sending itself are very different. So if I'm doing an all-out high intensity workout, I can occasionally for circuit training be doing this for more than an hour as well, so around the same time frame. But my blood sugar always invariably increases dramatically. I can have a huge blood sugar spike. For people who are familiar, I've hit over 200 milligrams per deciliter. If you use a CGM, that's well into the diabetic response to a meal from a high intensity workout. And what's happening there is that your body's producing adrenaline, epinephrine, and cortisol to tell your body you're in fight or flight mode produce as much fuel as possible. And so my liver is just taking all the molecules that are available, proteins, fats, turning them into glucose and shuttling them into the blood so that my muscles have it available. So this is a very normal response. I mean, it's not super common, but it's happening for all of us. We're all producing glucose during high intensity exercise. And that's a normal and adaptive thing, and actually is associated with improved insulin sensitivity over time. So, but the interesting thing there is that there's a big disparity between how my body responds to that slow, controlled zone 2 exercise and how it responds to the high intensity. And we should be fueling accordingly. So I don't need to take on a bunch of sugar. I don't need to eat a bagel or some Pop-Tarts before a high intensity workout because my body's producing that glucose for me. Now, if I'm on the bike and I'm going for a long ride, I will actually take some fuel on because I will burn that glycogen off slowly, and my body's not going to do that stress-related blood sugar production.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned lactate thresholds. Is there a correlation with glucose, insulin?
I think, this is an area that's absolutely fascinating because it's pretty understudied, but frequently referenced. A ton of athletes are thinking about lactate threshold, which is kind of the area where we transition from aerobic, primarily fat, but also largely glucose burning for exercise, into anaerobic, where our bodies are only using glucose, but they're doing it in a less efficient way. And so we produce a lot of byproducts, one of which is lactic acid. So essentially, when your body is short on oxygen and high on exertion, the glucose that you're burning, it starts to become, it basically shifts into this mode where you're only producing 2 ATP molecules per glucose molecule instead of 32 in the aerobic mode. I think I have that right. The point is that you start to build up a lot of lactic acid. And so that threshold, that crossover point, you really want to push that crossover point as high as possible into the sort of exertion domain. And the way we do that is we train right at the threshold. So what's interesting for me is that I see, like I said, during high intensity efforts, I see my glucose rising, and I know my lactic acid is rising because I'm feeling the burning. I've measured with a lactic acid, a lactate finger stick, and seen huge spikes in lactate. So both of those things are happening simultaneously. And I think there's probably a really fascinating optimization to be done in that area, both for recovery and sort of optimization of performance, and also just to better understand how lactate is involved in energy production. Because I know there are some scientists working on this, but I think the everyday person doesn't really understand lactate production and how we should be, for those of us that want to improve our cardiovascular endurance, how we should be using that lactate signal. So anyway, I can't offer much more than that. I think it's a really fascinating area. And this is one of the reasons I'm so excited about taking this continuous biological measurement tool and expanding it to new molecules. I think if we could have a continuous lactate monitor sometime soon, like CGM, it will be a fascinating new space.
I'm really looking forward to that as well. Adding more and more biomarkers would be very, very interesting.
Absolutely.
Something I wanted to bring up is the culture that you're building in Levels. I have seen that you're very intentional about remote work, that you're building the company in a way that is a very, very, very interesting way. What is your approach?
So Levels was a remote company from day one. Sam and I were living in different states. We decided we were going to start a company together in 2019. This was before remote work was on the map from COVID. And we just, decided we're not going to force the issue and try to relocate one of us. We're just going to work remotely because we were both comfortable with it. That then created an urgency. First of all, it created an opportunity for us when COVID happened because we had already grown the team to a few people and we were default remote. And in COVID, when we realized, that this was something that is going to actually become a strategic benefit to us, we needed to get really good at it. So it needed to not just be sort of like an attribute of the culture. It needed to be the core rationale of the culture we were building, needed to be grounded in the fact that we were remote and distributed. So the main principles are and this is going to be a little bit controversial for remote teams, but if you're going to be remote, you must be asynchronous. So what I mean by that is you can't try to replicate an in-office environment over Zoom. Nobody wants to do that. No one wants 8 hours of wall-to-wall Zoom calls replicating in-person meetings and interactions. So that demands asynchronous communication, right? So what we've done is we've built a culture that is grounded in the intention of of having deep work for every person every day. So respecting their time, making sure that they're not spending a ton of time repeating conversations over and over again. So asynchronous work, meaning long form documentation. So instead of having long meetings, we instead assign a directly responsible individual. This is the type of person that would be similar to a responsible engineer at SpaceX. They own a project. They write a long form, deeply thought out strategy memo for how we're going to execute on that project. They then share it with the team asynchronously. We all collaborate on it over the course of a day or so. We consume it. We think deeply about it. We add our input. That DRI then takes some of that information, updates the strategy, and executes. And through that whole time frame, there are no long meetings there, and there is no game of telephone where we're each repeating the same conversation over and over again. There's a single document that defines our strategy, which everyone can refer to, and which scales over time. So when you're going to hire somebody to come and work on a project, the first thing you can do is share that long form strategy memo that explains in detail, and they can see all the collaboration and all the input that everyone's done, explains in detail why we're doing what we're doing and what the other options that were considered were. And so that avoids a lot of the reconsidering what decisions we're making. So those are the two main things: is deep work, asynchronous by default. We're going so far as to, in long form memos, and we're going so far as to say that it is a default expectation of any person coming in the door that they can communicate effectively in the written format. So you have to be comfortable writing and communicating that way. We are also taking a firm stand against the tools that we think are essentially setting up perverse incentives in our work culture. One of them, and again, probably controversial, is Slack. I think a lot of people use Slack because it's recommended to them when they're starting a company. They don't consider the effects of a tool like that, which kind of forces everyone to be in the moment. You have to be there and see it happen in order to be able to contribute or know whether you're supposed to contribute. So we don't use Slack. We don't use any synchronous communication tools effectively. We've actually built our own communication platform internally in the sort of the image of our culture, which is very asynchronous. And so we're going out of our way to ensure that people understand the importance of communication, constantly keeping others up to speed. You don't have this environment. A lot of people picture an environment like ours and think, oh, so people just aren't talking to each other. It's just silence. And that's not actually the case. It's actually quite the opposite. People are pushing a lot of information that is discoverable. So if you need to know the status of a project, you know exactly where to go, how to pull that information. And you can, of course, get in touch with that person if you need. So I'll stop there. I think, radical accountability is one of our main things. Radical transparency we build in public, and long form documentation and deep work.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. What would you say are the benefits of having a culture this way?
So I think there's one major element, which is our transparency is unique. We have long been open about for example, our weekly team meetings, our Friday forums. We post those on our YouTube channel. We put our investor updates on our website after 12 months. The reason we do these sorts of things is we find that the major obstacle to Levels' success is not going to be sharing of ideas. It's going to be a failure to attract the right types of people that can execute on them. Mm-hmm. And one of the best ways to get somebody on board for a really good mission is to share it with them completely, not to hide things or create walls against it. The second best way is for the people that will benefit from the mission, that aren't going to be part of the team, our customers in this case, our investors, they should also benefit from seeing the process in action. And so we just decided, if we're going to change the way we believe that sort of the health industry should operate and the tool set that people have available to them, we're going to need to earn the trust of those people. And nothing's better than transparency and communication. And so those are, I think, the benefits we've seen have just been exponential in the sense that every person that joins our team has selected the culture that we've built. They aren't coming in spite of the culture. They're coming to this culture because it is the exact place that they want to work in the exact way that they want to work. And it also just buys tremendous goodwill. We had a community investment round as part of our Series A. And the round, we filled the initial allocation in 70 minutes, and we then doubled the allocation and filled that in 4 hours with only a single email, one communication on a Thursday morning. We did that against the better judgment of a lot of our advisors because we wanted people to be part of the mission. And the fact that it went so quickly, I think, is a testament to the fact that people feel very on board with this mission. They understand it. They've been communicated to as an equal, not as, not been talked down to. So anyway, I think that's one of the major things. And then again, the other major benefit of asynchronous by default is it makes work enjoyable. It makes it possible in a remote environment. A lot of people, I think, are kind of returning to office and they're sort of throwing in the towel on remote and saying that it's not going to work. Well, I agree. If you're replicating Zoom, like I said, in office culture on Zoom, it's not going to work. But the benefits for us is that we've built this culture in the way that we have, and it will have staying power and resilience because it's it's not trying to replicate in office.
The first question that comes to mind when you are so open about everything is, say that X competitor comes up today and they read the information that you get out. Is this going to help them or not?
Yeah, we get that question frequently, and I think the most important thing is a culture of speed, sort of obsoleting oneself rapidly, trying new things, experimentation, accountability. So making sure that people are responsible for their work and talent density, and then I think it comes down to just the degree of trust that the sort of winner of the space is going to have with their market. And we've found that those elements far outweigh the potential for somebody to sort of just copy and paste. I really don't think you can copy and paste trust. I don't think you can copy and paste speed of execution. And so I think those are the things that we've relied on, is that, especially in this space where I'm not going to pretend that there is some huge technological sort of IP that stands in the way of somebody else replicating what Levels is working on. We've seen lots and lots of, ever since Levels started, we've seen lots and lots of people get into the space, and that's okay. What we're sort of laser focused on is making sure that we are by far the thought leader in the space. We are led by the science. We follow the science. We drive the science, and that we move fast and with our members' health as the sort of paramount concern. So anyway, for all those reasons, I think having your ideas out there transparently, but moving fastest on them is a reasonable way to go.
Josh, two last questions. The first one is, what mental models are you using?
Well, I think one of the hardest things for founders to work through is prioritizing where to focus and breaking through hard decisions constantly. You can kind of feel like you get through one wall of a hard decision and then you're smashed right into the next one. And this can really be difficult. It's hard psychologically. What I like to do is think of a sort of 5 minutes, 5 days, 5 years sort of framework, which is like, does this decision or does this item matter in 5 minutes? Does it matter in 5 months, 5 weeks? Does it matter in 5 years? The goal is just to better understand, how consequential is this? Is this a one-way door? Is this a two-way door? Is this some small nagging insecurity that I'm facing that actually will not matter? And it really helps me to zoom out that way in steps, because it's very possible that something will matter in 5 weeks. And that's a pretty significant thing to pay attention to. If it doesn't matter in 5 minutes, why am I even thinking about it? And if it's going to matter in 5 years, that's where I should be focusing my attention. And so that's one way that just, it's like sort of practical, and I think has always helped. And then the next thing is, I think in terms of mental models, this is something that comes from SpaceX, and I think is actually quite easy to overdo. But just the first principles of a decision or of a project. I really like working with people who question pre-existing assumptions, especially the sort of best practices, and I'll put that in quotes, of an industry or of a technology. And I work with a lot of people. I'm happy to say that all of my co-founders and certainly Sam and I embrace this idea that we are not trying to just take at face value what exists out there. We are going to get straight to the root of a question and answer that first for ourselves. And only then, should we assume that something is what it is, right? And only once you understand how it interfaces with the laws of physics. Yes. So I just encourage people, don't let first principles become a buzzword or some throwaway term that we use all the time. It really has meaning. It means stop wasting time on the peripheral branches of a problem. Answer for yourself whether it can be done differently or more effectively. If you don't know, ask somebody else. But I really like to, frequently I'll sit down, and when there's a hard problem that really matters, I will start with a first principles model. I will literally write down what are the first principles of this problem. And until I understand them on that piece of paper, I won't move forward. So I really encourage people, let's not overwater or dilute that one. That it does matter a lot.
Mm-hmm. What is a good way for you to understand if someone is thinking from first principles during an interview?
I love that we have the culture we have, which is a long form written culture, because we will frequently give our candidates a technical memo or a technical challenge that is a memo, a long form written project. And that's an exceptional way to understand if someone's thinking from first principles. So rather than forcing them to answer on the fly, which I don't expect even of myself, instead articulate a hard problem and ask them to go and think about it and come back with a strategic memo, basically explain themselves. How would they approach this problem? What are the first principles of the problem? And then how would they address those? And that's the best way. It builds confidence immediately, trust, and it gives them the space to really go through the process they would go through in real life. Although at SpaceX we used to have gotcha interviews where you would get asked riddles and hard problems in person, I actually tend to believe that the better way to do this is to put people in the real world operating environment that they'll be in.
For the last one, what do you think is the future of? You mentioned 5 years earlier. So in 5 years, what do you think is going to be happening in terms of the hardware space of sensors? And what is the 5-year plan for Levels?
Well, Levels is working on biological observability. Biological observability is it's a bit of a mouthful, but what it means is that we need to be able to observe how the inputs to the human body create health outputs. And that requires us to measure a lot more things. Any system, this comes from control systems, but if a system is observable, meaning you can measure how inputs affect outputs, it is therefore controllable. This is just a mathematical reality. Today, we're trying to control health for decades, right? We're trying to be healthy when we're 80 years old, but we are not observing our health state. So we actually don't have control over our health. We are hoping and praying that we end up healthy. So what we're building is the infrastructure to enable biological observability. And eventually, I hope to be able to say that we are the biological controllability company where, it sounds maybe a little bit, maybe we should play with that one. But the goal being you can actually know which direction you're going and intervene and head to a better place. So biological observability is our objective. The way I see the market changing and adapting is we're going to have continuous molecular monitoring is here to stay, and it's in its very infancy. So we will see many more hardware players making it into the scene. They're going to be bringing many more detection modalities to the space. It's possible that you'll see a non-invasive glucose monitor on the wrist that will be sort of measuring very bulk things. I would say high, medium, or low glucose, for example, it might be able to do. But what I'm most excited about is the paradigm of minimally invasive, many molecule sensing. I think we're going to see something like that in the next 5 years that will give us, not just glucose, but lactate, lipids, inflammatory markers, on and on. And I cannot wait. I think in the future, we're going to think it's really crazy that we ever went through a time where our airplanes or our cars were generating gigabytes or terabytes of data per day, and we would get 5 markers in a blood panel once a year. It's just that's going away forever. So, and Levels is going to be right in the middle of all the data that we can give to people that we believe is actionable and can drive long-term health improvement.
Incredible. Josh, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kyriakos.